After 8 years of war, at the headquarters of Friedrich Wilhelm von Steuben, a group of American Revolutionary War officers inaugurated the first meeting of the Society of the Cincinnati. The society was a hereditary fraternal order formed with the intentions of remembering the monumental events of the American Revolution and preserving its spirit into the next generations, as well as fostering relations within the American officer class and among their descendants. The society quickly became a pseudo-political party, with interests not only in the eastern seats of power, but more lastingly in the new western frontier just over the Appalachian Mountains. In its time, the society was accused of harboring crypto-monarchist sentiments and neo-aristocratic aims, due to being modeled after the chivalric orders of England, as well as its associations with the French nobility. In 458 BC, during a time of great political turmoil in Rome, tribes of previously subjugated Latin and Sabine people began raiding into Roman territory, culminating in the occupation of the Roman city of Tusculum the next year. That year's consuls, Lucius Minucius Esquilinus Augurnus and Gaius Nautius Rutilius, each marched an army against Rome's enemies. Augurnus moved to liberate Tusculum, and Rutilius leading punitive expeditions against the tribal holdings in the hills. Soon thereafter, Augurnus found himself besieged in his camp at Mount Algidus, and dealing little in the way of a decisive blow, Rutilius returned to Rome. In Rome, the great and good panicked, and called upon one of their previous consuls, Lucius Quintus Cincinnatus, who was appointed after his predecessor was killed in a slave revolt that saw the Capitoline Hill occupied by Sabines. Cincinnatus restored a modicum of order before retiring to his rural villa, soured by his neck-deep foray into the politics of Romulus's cesspool. With one consul besieged and the other unable or unwilling to come to his aid, the Romans trusted only one man to take the reins in these troubling times. The Roman messenger found Cincinnatus in his garden, who heeded the call of duty, his wife fetching his formal toga and immediately departing for Rome. Within 15 days of being named dictator, essentially being made king of Rome, Augurnus and his men were saved. The tribes were subjugated once more, Rome was back in order, and Cincinnatus returned to his garden. A few years later, in 439, Cincinnatus was again called to be dictator following political upheaval in Rome, when Spurius Maelius, a wealthy plebeian, was accused of buying the favor of the poor with the alleged intent of being made king, a not-so-uncommon slur in Roman politics. Nevertheless, the threat was deemed serious enough that Cincinnatus was made dictator to sort out the situation. When Maelius failed to heed Cincinnatus's summons, he was killed by a band of patricians, sparking unrest among his supporters. After 21 days, Cincinnatus had stamped out any embers of disorder, putting things right again in Rome, and once more returned to his garden. The legend of Lucius Quintus Cincinnatus, the man given ultimate power to do a job, and actually did the job, and put down his power not once but twice, was seen as the ultimate expression of Republican politics. During and after America's War for Independence, comparisons between General Cincinnatus and the newly elected Commander-in-Chief General George Washington were not lost on the luminaries of the American Revolution. Quite the opposite, in fact. Washington's consistent stance after the war, despite the ideas of some of his officers and figures in society, Washington's steadfastness became, much like Cincinnatus, a legendary beacon for Republican politics the world over. While von Steuben hosted the Society's first official meeting, his headquarters being the manor house of the Verplanck family estate, now known as Mount Julian near Fishkill, New York, the Society was the idea of Major General Henry Knox, the Boston-born bookseller that had no previous military experience, who nevertheless became integral to the artillery portion of the Continental Army. After the Boston Massacre, Knox began, for a lack of a better term, researching warfare. After the Battle of Lexington and Concord, Knox and his wife would sneak out of the besieged Boston and join General Artemus Ward in developing fortifications around the city, as well as directing artillery fire at the Battle of Bunker Hill. As the siege dragged on, Knox suggested bringing cannons from the newly captured Fort Ticonderoga at the southern end of Lake Champlain, engaging in the legendary Noble Train of Artillery, which saw 60 of the fort's best artillery pieces trekked across the practically undeveloped and sparsely populated Berkshire Mountains in winter, losing no cannons and breaking the siege of Boston. This, and later actions as Washington's chief artillery officer, gave Knox a high level of prestige among Continental officers. So when, in April of 1783, in the wake of the preliminary agreements to peace between Britain and America, Knox proposed this society for the remembrance of the Revolution, many among them joined. Mostly membership was restricted to those officers who served the Continental Army or Navy for a period of at least 3 years, though exceptions were made for those whose service had ended with the war. Another exception was made for those who were killed or otherwise died during their service, with their membership falling to the officer's eldest male heir. Honorary membership, on the other hand, could not be passed on. Within the year, the Society of the Cincinnati had established one constituent organization in every state. These state-level organizations had more power than the overarching organization, as lower societies have their own particular rules regarding things like procedure and even later succession. While technically only one membership could be derived from one member, hypothetically, if you were a member in, say, New York's chapter, and your cousin was a member of the South Carolina chapter, it's unlikely one of you would be kicked out if someone was found. That said, each society had different rules, and due to the facts of life in the past, it was not uncommon for people to die heirless, and rules reflecting these realities, dictating indirect succession, became more common as time went on. George Washington was elected to be the first President General of the Society. While seemingly an honorary position, the President General had sway within the Society, though not absolute sway. Criticisms of the Society's practice of primogeniture hereditary membership, as well as its aristocratic aesthetic, were immediate. Popular sentiment was thoroughly reflected by Benjamin Franklin in a letter to his daughter Sarah, dated January 1784. I only wonder that when the united wisdom of our nation had, in the Articles of Confederation, manifested their dislike of establishing ranks of nobility by authority of either the Congress or any particular state, a number of private citizens should think proper to distinguish themselves and their posterity from their fellow citizens, and form an order of hereditary knights, in direct opposition to the solemnly declared sense of their country. George Washington motioned to abolish the hereditary aspect of membership, and, while most state-level societies agreed, New York, New Hampshire, and Delaware did not. unanimous consent was required to make the society-wide change. Thus, only the groups that accepted changed their membership requirements. That said, after the public outcry died down, the more liberal institution charter that was instantiated was quietly rescinded, and Knox's initial charter was reinstated. The Society of the Cincinnati's main symbol is the bald eagle, which was suggested by Major Pierre L'Enfant, the military engineer who drew up the initial plans for Washington, D.C., and waterways to channel the power of the Patterson Falls for industrial use. L'Enfant's suggestion made the Society of the Cincinnati the second official use of the bald eagle as an American symbol, behind the Great Seal of the United States itself. L'Enfant would travel to France in 1883 to commission silver eagle badges for the founding members, and 3 special diamond eagle badges for George Washington, one of which would be passed on as a symbol of the President General after his death. Another of the diamond eagles would be given to the Marquis de Lafayette during his 1824 Grand Tour, and is now on display at his former home Chateau Lagrange. The society had a special connection to France. King Louis XVI not only created a French branch of the Society of the Cincinnati, which acted as a hub for the society in Europe, but also wore its silver eagle badge, contrary to French law, which forbade the king from engaging with foreign symbols, though an exception was made in this case. Members of the Society of the Cincinnati, especially the more elitist ones, found themselves in feuds with other new pseudo-political fraternal orders, most prominently the Society of St. Tammany, which was organized as a response by rank-and-file members of the Continental Army. Tammany Hall, as it later came to be known, was integrated into politics by Aaron Burr, mortal rival of Alexander Hamilton, who, after the death of George Washington in 1799, became the new President General, and, of course, attempted to leverage the society for his political aims. For a look into that, I recommend watching my Tammany Hall Part 1, which explores the political situation in New York in the early Republic. A link to that will be up in the corner and down in the pinned comment and description. After Hamilton's ill-fated Weehawken duel in 1804, the seat of President General fell to Charles Cotesworth Pinckney, a prominent Federalist and close friend of Hamilton, who Pinckney had fought alongside at the battles of Brandywine and Germantown, and was actively running for president against Thomas Jefferson under Hamilton's leadership, the loss of which ended any chance for the Federalists to win the election. The Pinckney family were prominent planters in South Carolina's Low Country, cultivating cotton on their plantation at what is now the Pinckney Island National Wildlife Refuge in Beaufort County, owning some 200 or 300 slaves at this time. Pinckney ran for president a second time in 1808, this time against Jefferson's Secretary of State James Madison, whose opinion of the Cincinnati was at best ambivalent, soundly defeating Pinckney, who carried only 4 Southern electors, none of whom were from South Carolina. Between 1789 and 1801, New York City was run by Cincinnati Federalist Richard Varick, who served as Washington's aide-de-camp from 1781 through to the end of the war. Varick's mayorship is remembered for his response to 2 crises: the financial crisis of 1791, which led to a panic the next year, and the yellow fever epidemic of 1793. Varick's response to these crises, to us, were not spectacular, but, at the time, were practically revolutionary. After Alexander Hamilton had established the first Bank of the United States, some sought to take full advantage of the situation, and many of the merchants that formed the soil of what would become the New York Stock Exchange began to manipulate this nascent financial market, leading to a securities bubble that was stymied by a $150,000 purchase of public debt by the bank. This bailout prevented security prices from falling, but it was only a short kick of the can down the road before the bubble returned and burst in early 1792, the culprits of which were suddenly both rich and in mortal danger, as all the newly broke citizens of New York knew exactly who they were. These merchants, while in prison with a mob baying for their blood outside, worked with Varick and other merchants that had not participated to produce the Buttonwood Agreement, named for a prominent tree on Wall Street, which laid out the basic rules for securities trading in the city, with the New York City Stock Exchange still holding the May 17, 1792 signing date as its founding. Varick's response to the yellow fever outbreak the next year, which if you want to know how bad that is, I have a video on it, linked down below, also sowed seeds for how the city would respond to disease going forward, but as well laid the foundation of the present New York City Department of Health. Varick pushed his luck too far politically in the election of 1802, which saw Federalists swept from all levels of city government, which he then took as a sign to retire, returning to New Jersey, spending his remaining years developing Jersey City, which he had a hand in founding with Alexander Hamilton, shortly before his duel with Burr. Varick fulfilled his obligation to the Society of the Cincinnati's founding mission of remembering the Revolution, celebrating Washington's birthday with parades, open houses at significant locations, and even attending the lavish dinners of Tammany Hall, showing that, though divided politically, both sides could still put aside their differences to celebrate their common legacy. While many Cincinnati busied themselves with the business of Republican politics, some were carried by the tide crashing over the Appalachian Mountains, seeking fortune and glory in the frontier. Previous to the Revolutionary War, the British Crown had ceded all land west of the Allegheny Mountains in exchange for the 13 signatory native nations not joining France in their war. While the prohibition was largely unenforced, it likely prevented most large-scale endeavors to push west. Once Britain had no say in the matter, the backcountry was open, and the skills of a veteran military officer would be in high demand, especially one with such connections as a member of the Society of the Cincinnati. Fort Pitt, in the far west of Pennsylvania, at the forks of the Ohio, where the Allegheny and Monongahela rivers meet, was a strategically important position, not only for military matters, but also for the coming civilian influx into the Ohio Territory. At the end of the Revolution, 4 of Fort Pitt's garrison commanders were founding members of the Society of the Cincinnati, and when Pittsburgh was incorporated in 1816, the Pennsylvania Cincinnati and frontier hero Ebenezer Denny was elected its first mayor. Denny was a lieutenant at the end of the Revolution, and immediately became embroiled in the first of many official Indian wars waged by the United States, the protracted, decade-long Northwest Indian War against the loose Northwest Indian Confederation, a nearly desperate alliance primarily of the Huron, Six-Nation Iroquois, Shawnee, Delaware, Miami, Odawa, Potawatomi, and Ojibwe nations, slowly pushing the natives further and further west. Soon the frontier left the Pennsylvania backcountry, fully entering new territory and Ohio proper. Under the name Territory Northwest of the River Ohio, which encompassed the modern-day states of Ohio, Indiana, Michigan, Illinois, Wisconsin, and the portion of Minnesota east of the Mississippi River, this organized, incorporated territory was legally ceded to the United States in the Treaty of Paris and was governed by the former Washington aide-de-camp in Cincinnati, Arthur St. Clair, from its inception in 1787 to his removal in 1802. St. Clair was considered by his fellow settlers to be arrogant and his defeat at the Battle of the Wabash River in 1791 compounded his unpopular, partisan, and heavy-handed style of governance, leading to his replacement by President Thomas Jefferson. When Ohio was admitted to statehood the next year, the first state constitution had a weak executive as a reaction to St. Clair's tenure. In Ohio's southwest, at the roughly 311,000-acre Simms Purchase in what is now Hamilton, Butler, and Warren counties, Lusantaville was established opposite from where the Licking River in Kentucky flows into the Ohio. Lusantaville was a hub for flatboats taking settlers further down the river, and hosted Fort Washington, which defended the whole of western Ohio until it became obsolete after the defeat of the Northwest Confederacy following the Battle of Fallen Timbers, and was torn down in 1808. Due to the settlement's commercial and strategic importance, Governor St. Clair made a home there and organized Hamilton County around the settlement on January 2, 1790. 2 days later, purportedly on the urging of federal surveyor Israel Ludlow, St. Clair renamed Lusantaville to Cincinnati, which in all honesty is likely the only reason the majority of people have ever heard the name. After the founding of Cincinnati, the society largely became just another organization. As always happens, recent events eventually pass into history, and the people that were there pass into that same history and are in turn overshadowed by newer history. As the revolutionary generation gave way to the energetic antebellum and Civil War era, the society continued in the background, silently passing from generation to generation, doing what they could to keep alive the memory of a war fought longer and longer ago in places that were, for an increasing number of Americans, further and further away, or even in the East to people who had no connection to the revolution further than a wish to prosper in the land it created. As far as I can tell, it wasn't until the society acquired their current headquarters at the Lars Anderson House on Embassy Row in Washington, D.C., that the society gained a gust of wind in its sails. Today, the Society of the Cincinnati is not only active in the Revolutionary War history space, but the Anderson House also contains a society museum as well as a research library which has rare manuscripts, portraits, and models pertaining to American history since the Revolution. The society also works with their New Hampshire chapter to operate the American Independence Museum in Exeter, which has rare drafts and copies of the Constitution, in addition to other historic artifacts like medals and household goods. The biggest thing the Society of the Cincinnati has now is their Society of the Cincinnati Prize, which recognizes the author of a work that advances the understanding of the American Revolution. First presented to Bernard Bailyn for his work Voyagers to the West, a passage in The Peopling of America on the eve of the Revolution in 1989. Originally presented every 3 years, since 2020 the prize is now presented annually. Almost 25,000 years ago, the legendary actions and decisions of one man on 2 separate occasions gave a name to an organization of men who sought to have their legendary actions and decisions remembered, so that future generations could look back with clear eyes and see such things are possible, as they looked back and saw Lucius Quintus Cincinnatus. It's encouraging to know that despite wars, political rivalries, the breakneck advance of technology, as well as an ever-shifting culture, almost 250 years ago, a group that started with the goal of remembering the monumental event of the American Revolution and preserve its spirit into the next generations is still around, fulfilling the hopes of those that put everything on the line for this nation that we all too often take for granted. Thank you for watching or listening. If you liked this video, leaving a like is greatly appreciated, and subscribing to Mid-Atlantic Chronicles even more. If you have a topic from American history you would like explored, feel free to leave a comment. Thank you again.